Happy Thursday, everybody. Good to see you.
Hi, everybody.
Come on in. Um, my name is Rachel Scheinerman. Host, I have the pleasure of hosting this weekly Daf Yomi in lightning review class where we spend a half hour looking at some highlights of what we studied in Daf Yomi last week. And special thanks to Rabbi Elliot Goldberg, who does this frequently, but was not slated to join today, but stepped in for another teacher who became ill. So we're extra grateful to have you this morning, and I think we can go ahead and get started.
Right. It's my pleasure to step in. And since I'm doing Daf Yomi, I studied this week, even though, um, you know, I got ready for this faster than usual, but that's okay. Um, we've been reading about witness testimony in capital cases. Um, and I thought it was a moment to reflect a little bit on how the rabbis think about testimony and evidence that supports a case. Um, and because I think there's some fundamental ways it's different in the rabbinic system than the way it is in our system, right? I'm in North America, right? I'm in the United States, North America. So I know we have a diverse audience. Your country might have a little bit of a judicial system too. I'm going to speak from my experience for where I am. I want to start with just saying, like, from the, I don't know if you've had a chance to do this, but I've sat on a jury before, and at that moment when I was on a jury in a DUI case, um, and what shocked me about the process was the way the number of witnesses and the way in which they were questioned was different from what I expected, and I realized that my understanding, I have a little bit of a theoretical understanding of the American court system, but what I thought happened in courts is basically what I see on TV and TV, crime dramas or courtroom dramas, which was I was shocked by the contrast of what the pace of the court and what actually happens compared to what we see on TV. I'll give you one example about that. Like that, a person was accused of drunk driving. They were they had been in downtown watching a hockey game, had wine at dinner, had some drinks, watching a hockey game, drove home hours later. That was sort of the story. And then we had a police officer who said they were drunk, and they said, no, I wasn't. And like that was basically all the evidence. And I'm thinking, because I know on Law and Order, like the bartender from the bar that they watched the hockey game at would have been a character who would have produced, the visa receipt to find some evidence based on which you could determine what was happening in this trial. And I discovered that while the TV writers have time to write in all these details, it seemed that the pace of the court system for this in particular, there weren't a lot of witnesses and there wasn't a lot of evidence to actually consider when we went to the jury room to try to decide the fate of this person. Luckily, no one was hurt in the incident. It was just about whether they would keep their driving status or not. And it made me think of, from TV, I thought we had there would be more evidence, there would be more things. And what we were given to um, base our decision on was much less than I thought um, happens in most cases. And it made me think about, so I spent some years after that talking to friends who were lawyers about, is this normal? Does this always happen? But anyways, thinking about that, in the American court system, right, the judge presides over the case, but the jury, in most trials are jury trials, the jury makes a decision. The jury doesn't actually, right, who decide the fate don't actually ask any questions of the witnesses. They just watch the trial and they deliberate after. Meaning it's the lawyers who are presenting the case on each side, bringing their witnesses, showing their evidence. And while there are questions and answers, they come from partisan people at the trials, meaning the prosecution is partisan. They want to convict. They're asking lots of questions of the witness to try to paint a picture. And the defense is trying to prove that their client is innocent. And they ask a lot of questions to try to show that the person is innocent. Um, and it's different, we're discovering in the Talmud, in that it's the judges who serve as the role of judging the case, but they're also the ones who ask the questions and conduct the trial. There's not the separation between lawyers who are presenting a picture that right, a judge who's making sure the rules are followed, lawyers who are asking questions to try to show a case and convince a jury, and a jury is supposed to deliberate about what's the best evidence or not to decide innocent or guilty. Right, as we've been reading in the rabbinic trial, right, the judges who make up the court are judge and jury, and they're not exactly the attorneys, but they're the ones who investigate, who ask questions of the witnesses. And the standard in the rabbinic courts in trying to determine what's truthful is when evidence is corroborated by multiple sources, right? You need at least two sources based on a verse in the Torah, at least two sources to uphold a fact in a case. More is fine. But what the judges are charged to do is to ask lots of questions of the witnesses to determine if the witness testimony, what they're saying, lines up. And it's the congruence of multiple witnesses that lead to determining what the facts are, that lead to determining what actually happens. And it's a different pursuit of truth, right? It's not about who can build the best case. It's not about who can paint the most convincing picture of what happened. Who can, argue that this evidence is trustworthy and this evidence is not, which we have in the American court system. But it's a place where the judges have to see, do the people who saw this thing happen have the same story? And if they have the same story, then those become the facts of the case. And if the facts of the case say, based on the corroborated evidence, that the person's innocent or guilty, that's what happens. Of course, there's still some opinion there because we have, as we know, for whatever different cases are, there are odd number judges panels who vote, and not every case. Right, cases don't have to be unanimous. You might have two judges think a person is guilty, and one judge thinks there's innocent, and then the person becomes guilty. So it's still based on some assessment from the judges. There's not some sense that there's an automatic that we are going to uncover the truth. They still have to decide what they think based on what they heard. But the dynamics are different in the courtroom from what we're used to in our context, or how the trials, at least here in America, are run. So with that, a little bit as background, I want to jump into one slice of this in particular. I'm going to put a link right now to the slides. I know some of you like to look at the slides. I'm going to put them up on my screen this moment. Here we go. And I'm going to start the slideshow. Hopefully from the beginning. There we go. All right. Give me a moment to, of course, the Zoom windows always come up right on the top of the words for me. So the Mishnah that we read earlier in the week says, with regard to all judges who increase the number of examinations, this is praiseworthy. Right, the Mishnah says, right, the judges are supposed to ask questions of the witnesses to make sure that their stories line up. And the Mishnah tells us, the more you do here, the better. Right, and the phrase, right, this is praiseworthy, hareza mishubach, right, that's the same. That might echo if you have your own memories of the liturgy for the Passover Seder, right? Whoever stays and tells the story of Passover longer, this is better, this is praiseworthy, right? The rabbis sometimes make statements about, where you can increase, where you could go to the nth degree, and that's a good thing. There are sometimes where going to the nth degree is not a good thing, but this is one of the times where they say it is a good thing. The more the judges ask questions, the better it is. Why? Because the more questions you ask, the more opportunities you have to check that the stories of the witnesses line up, and the more likely you are to getting to an accurate picture of what happened, because you'll figure out what are the things that actually happened, because multiple witnesses are reporting the same thing. And this, as we've also seen this week, and we'll continue to in the conversations that are coming as we talk more about capital trials, where the accused life is in jeopardy if they're found guilty. This is especially true for the rabbis because, right, in a financial case, if you make a mistake or if some evidence comes up later, right, there are some ways in which, not in all cases, but things can be rectified. Or if someone loses a financial case and it turns out there was a mistake, It's only money, you might say. It could be a lot, but it's only money. But in a capital case, you can't reverse capital punishment. So examining carefully, especially as much as you can, is praiseworthy because that will help make sure we don't execute someone who shouldn't be executed. And the Mishnah makes a reference to a case, an incident occurred, and Ben Zakkai examined the witnesses by questioning them about the color and shape of the stems of figs. This is their example to say you should increase the number of examinations when you're talking to the witnesses. The more you do, the better. And who's the most praiseworthy, or who's someone who is praiseworthy? Ben Zakkai is, because there's a trial we know about where he started asking the witnesses to testify about the color and shape of stems of figs. Not even just the figs themselves, but the stems of the figs. So a detail of a detail of a detail, color, right? Color and shape, not just of figs, but their stems. This is an example of increasing the number of examinations. So first, a little tangent, then we'll come back to this piece about testimony. You'll notice here it says Ben Zakkai. The Ben Zakkai we talk about most is Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai, who is a leader of the Sanhedrin. There are lots of stories of a prominent rabbi in the Mishnah, not often referred to just as Ben Zakkai because he was Rabban, the head of the Sanhedrin, right? Yochanan Ben Zakkai. And so it's odd here that he's sort of just referred to by like his father's name and not his full title. There's a conversation in the Gemara about who actually this person is, and some people think it's Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai, character you used to sing, and some other opinions just say it's just some judge named Ben Zakkai who's not him. I thought I would just point that out. Not the focus for today, but something interesting to see that when you see a name, you might jump to conclude which rabbinic personality that person's affiliated with, but we're not sure actually based on the fact that the first part of his name, which he would, if it is Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai, he's usually not called just Ben Zakkai, so we don't know who it is. And about this, to bring it back to testimony, this is mostly what we know about this incident, and there aren't so many details here. So the Talmud isn't such a good witness, and we don't have a second source to really verify this. And that question of who exactly is this character, we're not exactly sure about. But he's praised for examining things to the nth degree, even the color and shape of the stems of the figs. So let's move to the Gemara, where we see this statement is true, but not all the time. Meaning this teaching of the Mishnah, because in the Gemara, we flip slides. Here we go. We learn a teaching of Rav Chisda that becomes the law. Rav Chisda says, in a case where one of the witnesses says the murderer killed the victim with a sword, and one of the witnesses says the murderer killed the victim with a ariran, which is some other kind of weapon, not translated here because we're not sure exactly what specific kind of weapon it is or what ariran means, and the commentators have lots of different opinions, but it's clear from the context and the conversation in the Gemara that it's a non-sword weapon of some sort or different from a plain sword. And so if the two witnesses come testify about a murder weapon, they say the murder weapon was different. Each of them has a different story about what the murder weapon was. Rav Chisda says this is not congruent testimony, meaning that testimonies of the witnesses don't line up. And that means their testimony is not valid, and we can't convict a person based on what they report, since they don't have the same story about what weapon was used in the murder. That's the case in the courthouse. But, says Rav Chisda, if one of the witnesses say the murder garments were black, and one of the witnesses say the murderer's garments were white, this is congruent testimony. So he says, if there's a difference in what the witnesses report about the color shirt that the murderer was wearing, that doesn't disqualify their testimony. So what's Rav Chisda trying to teach here? It seems he's trying to tell us that the details that matter to us in the witness testimony are the details about specifically what happened relevant to the crime that is being judged in the court case. And if there are other details that the witnesses have differences, those don't matter. So while the Mishnah said, right, ask a lot of questions, the more you do, the better, Rav Chisda sort of saying, well, ask a lot of questions about the things that are relevant, and the things that aren't relevant, those questions, you don't have to dig in there because it doesn't matter so much. right? Now I'm going back to thinking about, if one witness I know this more from TV than actual courts, right? I hear the lawyer on the TV drama saying, "Oh, one witness said this was black, and one witness said it was white." And if the witnesses can't even figure out what the person was wearing that day, like you can't wear a black shirt and a white shirt, we have no proof that our person was there because no one, none of the testimony is muddled. We don't have a clear picture because they're fuzzy on some details. What Rav Chisda seems to be saying is we can't argue about the fuzziness of details when they're separate from um, the ones that matter in describing the crime that happened. Right? If the person murdered the person, it matters if they use a sword or if they use an ariran or some other weapon. And so there, a difference in testimony doesn't matter. But if it's about what clothes they were wearing, right, that's not a pertinent fact to us. And those details we don't have to drill down as much because we're not looking to expose a difference there because the difference in that testimony doesn't matter so much. And in the conversation about Rav Chisda's teaching, the rabbis return to the incident of Ben Zakkai and the figs. Um, and they say the following. Come and hear some proof from the Mishnah. An incident occurred, and Ben Zakkai claimed that witnesses right, examined the witnesses about the stems of figs. Right, the Gemara is talking about is Rav Chisda's statement that we see here correct? Is it true that some details matter and some details not? And they can say, well, let's use go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says um, Ben Zakkai examined the witnesses about stems of figs. Stems of figs have to be a detail far more irrelevant than white shirts and black shirts. But if he's being praised for going down to that detail, it seems maybe that Rav Chisda is wrong. Right? This is a challenge statement to Rav Chisda, saying Rav Chisda said some details matter, some details don't. But according to the statement we saw from the Mishnah and the reference to the case of Ben Zakkai when he examined witnesses about the stems of figs, um, it seems he's going down to details, and the stems of figs seem to be more analogous to the colors of the shirt than to the type of weapon. So it must be that Rav Chisda is wrong. So Rami Bar Chama says, well, what are we talking about there? We're talking about a case where the person who's accused is accused of picking figs on Shabbat, and you, breaking Shabbat is a capital offense. So it matters, like the inquiry about the figs on the stems and did he pick them and did he not? This is a detail that's pertinent to the nature of the picking that the person did. And so Ben Zakkai, in going down to that detail, is actually going down to that detail about something relevant because the stem is relevant to picking when you're talking about figs. And so this must matter. And then, this is more analogous to the sword and the ariran and not the colors of shirts, which says that, Rav Chisda's statement still holds. Uh, I've been thinking about this part a little bit. This was in a piece I wrote this week. My friend Josh, who sits across the aisle from me in Shul, said to me, "What's this about figs? And what's this about?" We were talking about murders, and now we're talking about Shabbat. Like, what did they really try people in capital cases for crimes on Shabbat, for breaking Shabbat? So I got that question. I thought I would sprinkle that into this today. That it's interesting here that they shift gears, and we'll see what the Gemara does with it in a moment. Um, the Torah says breaking Shabbat is a capital crime. There's a very short story in the Torah about one of the Israelites in the desert going out to pick sticks on Shabbat. I guess they ran out of sticks for their fire. You're not supposed to light a fire on Shabbat either. But anyway, he collects sticks on Shabbat, which you're not supposed to do, and he gets the death penalty for that. And that's a place where the Torah makes clear breaking Shabbat is a capital offense. So it comes into this conversation here as a way to explain how maybe defend Rav Chisda in light of Ben Zakkai to say, well, the case that Ben Zakkai was trying was one about Shabbat, so the stems of the figs matter. If someone was, harvesting their figs on Shabbat, that might matter. But I find it is an interesting thing to call out because we're in a run of chapters talking about capital crimes, and the capital crimes they're mostly talking about are Ben Adam Chaviro, right? Crimes people commit to others, right? Murder. There are, not breaking Shabbat, and not so many of the examples that we see in Sanhedrin about breaking of Shabbat. And it led me to think about that, well, it's possible that the rabbis are trying to enforce Jewish law, brought people to trial about breaking Shabbat, but the rabbis throughout the Talmud know about, talk about, right, Jews who are less observant than them. And, as historians speculate, we don't think the rabbinic norms that the rabbis were discussing in the Talmud were practiced by the whole Jewish community. The same way we have diverse practice today, there's probably diverse practice back then, especially in the time of the Mishnah, where the Ben Zakkai story is placed, because we know in the time of the Mishnah, the Jewish community had lots of different groups, had lots of different thoughts about how to practice. So it's probably unlikely that there was an actual case about someone who broke Shabbat who was brought to trial, and potentially, right, killed for that. It's not clear that, right, the rabbis had the authority to act on cases of capital punishment and execute people, at least during the Roman period, at all. But it's also not clear that sociologically in their era they had some way to do that about Shabbat. But the first suggestion here to try to defend Rav Chisda suggests that maybe this is a case about Shabbat, and we're dealing with figs, and the picking of figs is very relevant, so that's why we have that. But if you're not so sure about figs and Shabbat and whether that could be, well, the Gemara isn't so sure either. They have the challenge voice comes back and says, "Wait a minute, we have a Braita that says when Ben Zakkai asked the witnesses about the questions of the stems of figs, they said to him, the murder killed the victim beneath the fig tree, indicating that this is speaking of a murder case, right? And there's a question mark here saying, right, wait, what are you talking about? It's about Shabbat. This is a murder case, because what were they talking about? Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was asking about the figs because the testimony of the witnesses was saying the place where the murder was committed was underneath a fig tree, and that's how figs came into it. So it actually wasn't a Shabbat case; it was a murder case, like the rest of the cases we've been talking about in this sort of section. And the reason why figs came into it is the place of the murder was under a fig tree, and so he had to ask him about the figs. But that goes back and raises a question again about Rabbi Chia, who said, ask about what's relevant, not what's relevant. Like, you can establish it was under a fig tree, but if one witness has said the figs on that tree had big stems and thick stems, and the other witness says the figs on that tree had thin stems, but they both agree, oh yeah, but it's that tree right outside the schoolhouse, the third one from the left where it happened. If they agree about the tree and not about the actual figs that grew there, we might be back to what Rav Chisda said, that the tree might matter because establishing the place of the murder might matter, but the figs, that might seem like not a detail that matters. And if the Mishnah say, if it's really true that he was drilling down about the stems and the color of the figs on this tree, which is a little side note as opposed to more pertinent to establishing that a murder happened, maybe Rav Chisda isn't the guiding principle, and you're supposed to act about all details, and any difference in testimony, even about the stems of the figs, in a case where a murder took place under a fig tree, would cause the witness's testimony to not be accepted and the case to go away. But Rami Bar Chama comes to clarify and says, well, when the Mishnah is speaking about a case, the Mishnah is speaking about a case where the murderer stabbed the victim with a branch of a fig tree. So they go back to saying, why is Ben Zakkai asking about the shape of the figs and its stems? Well, it's not just that the murder took place under the fig tree. The fig tree, or part of it, in and of itself, was a murder weapon. So if the murderer grabbed a branch off the tree and stabbed the victim with it, determining the nature of the branch, whether it has thick or thin stems on the figs, might make a difference about determining if the murder happened, because the stems of the figs are part of the murder weapon, and then this is something that you ought to ask about. There are a few more back and forths about this conversation moving forward, but where the Gemara leaves us is where the Mishnah says, "Inquire. The more you inquire, the better." The Gemara, through the teaching of Rav Chisda, says, well, the more you inquire, the better about things that really establish the murder, about the facts that are connected to actually the act that is the crime. There are side facts. There are additional things that witnesses might testify about but we don't hold them to 100% congruity on everything, which is one way you could read the Mishnah. But instead, the place where we're looking for testimony of witnesses that lines up are about the facts that matter in establishing that a crime has been committed and that the accused has done it or not. And so smaller differences about less relevant things don't matter. And that's where the Gemara lands at the end. Depending on how you read the Gemara, this might be a case of the Mishnah saying, investigate, 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 ask, to try to get about every detail. And the Gemara saying, nope, only some. It could be a case where the Gemara is limiting the Mishnah, or it could be a case as the second voice that responds to the challenges in this passage say, they're actually telling us, no, the Gemara really means just the facts that are pertinent to the crime. And instead of being a limiting of the Mishnah, it's actually an explanation of the Mishnah where the Mishnah was not exact in its language. And the Gemara is clarifying and being more exact so we understand a little more about what it is. Which of those two it is, we have no way for sure to tell. In its origins, we can only interpret. We know the halachic commentaries side with Rav Chisda, as does the tradition. So there's a vote from the past to say the Gemara, we follow Rav Chisda and not more open. But how Rav Chisda is shifting the Mishnah, there's still some questions about. And that's part of the fun of Gemara because we could still debate that today. All right, I am back to you. Sorry, I've left less time than I like to for questions. I apologize for that. But we might have time for a couple before we have to go. I see there's been a conversation in the chat, which I missed while I was looking at the other slide. So I don't know, Rachel, if you have something to shout out from or if you want to.
Let's do it this way. Let's invite people to raise their hands if they want to throw something in. Yeah, I will just say the thing that always goes through my head in these scenarios is also like the fallibility of human memory. We don't remember things as well as we think we do. Our brains fill in details
Yeah.
easily and that makes it extra.
Yeah, that's an issue in any. I mean, the literature, what the psychologists say about court cases is like, people are not good witnesses in general. It raises questions about any of the any trial in any society. It's hard to get to the truth because we don't always remember right. All right.
You seem quite aware of that. Laura.
So a few of us had a question about just to hear it, we've read it, but the difference between examination and what was interrogation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is this Mishnah that I referred to says, right, in the opening session, it says, right, there's Chakirot and Bidikot, right? We investigations, interrogations, and then we sort of say we investigate. The Mishnah says something like we interrogate the witness with investigations, or it might be I might have reversed it in the English. And there's it comes to be something that the Mishnah draws a distinction between one kind of one of these matters. A difference in testimony is less relevant, and another matter, the testimony is more relevant. The Mishnah makes that distinction between the two. The Gemara doesn't expand so much on it, and it makes it muddied, meaning it's actually something I dug into last night to say, hey, there's a piece of this that I would love to bring to this group. And I would say this. So one, in full disclosure, I don't have full clarity on this. There's some questions in my head about what's the difference between one and the other. Rav Chisda could be pointing to the difference about that there's one of them is more, right? I'd have to go back to the Mishnah, which I don't have. In the minutes we have left, I don't have time to pull it up to look at the text to see, but there's one of those categories where the differences don't matter and one does matter. And there are two different verbs that the Mishnah uses. But I have to say, I think it's one of these places where the Mishnah isn't fully clear and the technical difference between the two is definitely not defined in the Mishnah. And Rav Chisda might be trying to help define it this by saying one thing is relevant and one thing is not. But it also seemed to be that there were a set version of questions that the Mishnah lists that you first have to say. And I think this is what Steinsaltz says. There's that first level of question asking that's about making sure the crime happened. What day, what time of day, where was it, who was the murderer? There's some basic facts you establish because, and those questions are the first ones where you just need, you don't need the testimony to line up. You just need to have enough to say a crime may have been committed and we can have the trial. So establishing the facts of the trial doesn't have the same standard of then the evidence you need to convict once the trial happens. And we need that more congruent testimony when we're determining the exact details as opposed to did someone actually get killed. So that's, I think, if I remember right, what Steinsaltz brings to explain the difference between the two. But I have to say, at this moment in time, I'm still a little fuzzy about that. I need to keep doing some drilling down before I'm satisfied. And I just, in the room of Daf Yomi people, I would say the challenge of Daf Yomi is the deeper you drill on a question like this, the more pages behind you get, reading forward.
Aaron in the chat is asking or suggesting that maybe interrogations require a vow and examinations not. Do you remember that?
I don't.
No, okay.
I don't, and I
put
do
it
have
out
to say
there.
this is, yeah, what I do want to validate, Laura, is I had your question. And I want to
next week.
Right. Yeah, maybe next week. Right. If I'm back, I could try to get back to you. I was going to say in 7 years we'll be back in this chapter. Maybe the second chapter you have time for this. But it is what I find is a challenge of Daf Yomi. I have a long list of things I want to investigate further that will slow down my goal of reading the Talmud, and we all have to make those choices. I mean, we can find the answer to it. I just don't have it on my fingertips. And I see, I see in the chat as we're talking, people are bringing that in. Anyways, thanks for that question, though.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to call it there, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg, for stepping in to teach today. And we will see you in this space in exactly a week and in your inbox tomorrow morning. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
All right, take care, everybody.